Part 31. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 301. At this time, Lin Yu's soul was repeatedly rubbed and torn apart. He didn't know how long it had been, and how many times he had experienced it. In the end, Lin Yu was even numb. He was drowsy for countless times. In the end, Lin Yu heard a voice in a trance, "Sleep, sleep, this is an endless cycle, this is your resting place, anyway, you will come here to sleep sooner or later, it's better to do it now." When Lin Yu heard the voice, he nodded gently. "Okay." Just when Lin Yu was about to fall asleep, a dragon roar suddenly came out from the depths of his sea of consciousness, and Lin Yu suddenly woke up at this moment. At this time, Lin Yu looked around and found that his surroundings were originally turbid, but now they were a little clearer. Then, a person's shadow suddenly appeared in front of Lin Yu. Lin Yu stared at the guy standing in front of him, and a gloomy look flashed in his eyes. At this time, his face darkened, and then he said in a cold voice, "Who are you?" The man saw that Lin Yu had woken up so suddenly, and his face was slightly shocked at the time, but after a moment, he shook his head and smiled. "You don't need to care about who I am, but I'm just curious about how you woke up." At this time, Lin Yu suddenly laughed. "Why should I tell you?" The man was obviously stunned, but after a moment, he shook his head, "Just because I am the real Lord of Reincarnation, and just because this Eye of Reincarnation is actually my territory, do you think these 2 points are enough?" The man's eyes stared straight at Lin Yu, and the corners of his mouth also raised a faint smile. At this time, even after Lin Yu saw this scene, the corners of his eyes and eyebrows flashed with an unbelievable look. Lin Yu stared at the man straight, and then he couldn't help but frowned, but at this time Lin Yu just shook his head, "Of course not enough." The Lord of Samsara seemed to have never seen a guy like Lin Yu. After all, over the years, even if someone accidentally entered the Eye of Samsara, they were respectful to him, but now Lin Yu didn't appreciate it at all. So at this time, he waved his hand lightly, and then Lin Yu felt that he was completely bound by an inexplicable force. Only at this time did he feel that he was like an ant in front of this surging force. At this time, Lin Yu's face suddenly became ugly, his eyebrows seemed to be twisted together, and there was a bit of gloom in his eyes. "Interesting, it's really interesting, this power is really quite weird." At this time, although Lin Yu was a little afraid in his heart, he didn't show it on his face. After seeing this scene, the man's eyes flashed with a cold light, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Interesting, I didn't expect you to be so stubborn, it seems that it's time to add more stuff." The man's face suddenly became ferocious, and then he laughed loudly. At this moment, he was full of madness, which made people a little scared. At this time, after seeing the man's appearance, Lin Yu's eyes were full of special colors, and then he couldn't help but turn his head and glanced at the man. His eyebrows twisted slightly, and a special smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. After seeing this scene, the man suddenly rushed towards Lin Yu again, and then he said something at the corner of his mouth. At this time, Lin Yu just slightly turned to the side, and then he dodged the guy directly. After waiting for this moment, the man's face suddenly darkened, and his face instantly became ferocious. "Boy, you dare to dodge, you dare to dodge." Perhaps because he had stayed in the Eye of Samsara for too long, Lin Yu could sense the madness of the Lord of Samsara. The Lord of Samsara might be like crazy. "Do you want to leave here? Do you want to get it? The real liberation is not as crazy as it is now." Lin Yu suddenly spoke, and the Lord of Samsara heard Lin Yu. After saying this, a few complex colors flashed in his eyes, and then his eyes stared straight at Lin Yu, and a few strange things flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. "What do you mean? What do you want to say?" The Lord of Samsara spoke to Lin Yu in a cold voice, but at this moment he seemed to be much calmer than before. Lin Yu raised a playful smile at the corner of his mouth. He turned his head and glanced at the Lord of Samsara. A hint of amusement flashed in his eyes. I mean, I can help you, but the premise is that you have to tell me how to help you. The Lord of Samsara was obviously completely impressed by Lin Yu's condition. At this time, he couldn't help but burst into laughter. Ha ha ha, no problem, as long as you are willing to help me. As long as you are willing to help me. Lin Yu raised his eyebrows slightly. I just said that I can help you, but you have to tell me how to help you. It's very simple. As long as you can help me kill that guy and take away the mark of reincarnation from him, then I can be completely freed. At this time, Lin Yu had 3 black lines on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. The mark of reincarnation? I'm afraid it will be a little difficult to get this thing back. After the man heard what Lin Yu said, he turned his head and glanced in his direction, and then nodded slightly. It is indeed quite difficult. That guy is not weak. If you, little guy, are in the current situation, it will be no different than dying. Although even Lin Yu had to admit that what this guy said was right, when he heard what this guy said, he still felt a little unhappy in his heart. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 302. And that person seemed to notice that Lin Yu's face was quite unhappy at this moment, so he waved his hand casually and smiled. It's just a joke with you. Why do you take it so seriously? In fact, this matter is difficult to say and easy to say. After Lin Yu heard what the man said, he couldn't help but half closed his eyes. Then he turned his head and glanced at the man, staring straight at that guy. On the body. How do you say this? I can give you a fortune, but only if you little guy can bear it. The man turned his head and stared directly at Lin Yu. At this moment, Lin Yu felt as if he had seen the sea of stars. He nodded subconsciously, and there was a flash of light in the corners of his eyes and brows. It has a somewhat special color. There's nothing that's too much for me yet, so go ahead. Lin Yu just whispered like this. But at this moment, the man's hands were clasping together like this and chanting a mantra, and then he drew a circle on Lin Yu's head. At this time, Lin Yu felt as if he could communicate with the world in an instant. At this time, a look of disbelief flashed across his face. His eyes were staring straight at that person, and there was a look of disbelief in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. How is this possible? How did you do it? Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at that guy. But at this moment, after hearing Lin Yu say this, the man looked completely mysterious, and a few meaningful smiles appeared at the corners of his mouth. As the saying goes, secrets cannot be revealed. After Lin Yu heard what the guy said, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He rolled his eyes at the guy angrily. If you don't want to say it, forget it, I won't force you. You should be able to fight that guy when you go out now. The mark of reincarnation is also on his forehead, but you have to wait until you kill him before the mark of reincarnation can become this ownerless thing. You bring this reincarnation mark back to me, and I can go out. Lin Yu nodded lightly, but at this time, he always felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't explain exactly what it was. Lin Yu's eyes narrowed to a slit, and then he couldn't help but shook his head slightly and frowned. The man's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. What? Are you doubting me? The man obviously saw it. At this moment, there was some doubt on Lin Yu's face. At this time, he did not hesitate to say it. However, in the palm of the man's hand, a force was quietly moving. It seemed as if Lin Yu would die here as soon as he answered yes in the next second. Of course, Lin Yu could feel the surge of power around him. At this time, he just shook his head and smiled. No, I was just thinking about how I should kill that guy. The man just smiled slightly. Don't worry too much. With your current strength, It's easy to kill that guy. Just do it. The man's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu. At this time, after hearing what the guy said, Lin Yu's expression also condensed slightly, and then he spoke so lightly. He nodded. At this moment, Lin Yu broke through the eye of reincarnation and came out, and then rushed straight towards the guy in the next second. Lin Yu's speed was extremely fast. In just a short moment, he had already arrived in front of that person. At this time, others saw Lin Yu waving his arm towards the previous Lord of Reincarnation, and just hit him directly. Obviously, the man was also completely shocked by Lin Yu's actions. He watched Lin Yu getting closer and closer to him, and the speed was getting faster and faster. At this moment, there was a hint of excitement in his eyes. A look of surprise. A moment later, the Lord of Reincarnation's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. At this time, a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Ha ha ha, it's interesting. It's really interesting. I didn't expect that guy to really lend you the power of reincarnation. But don't think you're lucky, because I was fooled in the same way before. Lin Yu heard the Lord of Reincarnation. After he said this, his eyes evoked a special color, and then he turned his head and glanced coldly at the Lord of Reincarnation. A slight sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Really? But this time you are going to die, and I said, no one can save you. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed directly on the Lord of Reincarnation, and his murderous intent was revealed in the blink of an eye. At this time, the Lord of Reincarnation couldn't help but shook his head and smiled. If you want to kill me, you must first have this ability. I don't think you have such ability now. The Lord of Reincarnation stared at Lin Yu with a smile on his face, his eyes full of ridicule. After hearing what the Lord of Reincarnation said, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with complicated colors, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. It's useless to talk more. If that's the case, then let's fight to the death today. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he rushed towards the Lord of Samsara, and the two of them fought each other. After teasing for a while, the Lord of Samsara lowered his voice and faced Lin Yu. Said so coldly. Boy, if you really believe his nonsense, then I have nothing to say, but I want to advise you. This guy is very cunning and cunning. You must not fall for his trap. When Lin Yu heard the Lord of Reincarnation say this, a mocking smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Now it looks like you can't beat me, and now you've come up with such a plan, right? But do you think I will believe you? Don't waste your efforts here. After the Lord of Samsara heard what Lin Yu said, he was almost angry to death. At this time, he stared directly at Lin Yu. Asshole, you don't believe me, even if you kill me, you will regret it sooner or later. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 303. At this moment, Lin Yu obviously didn't believe what this guy said, and there was just a sneer at the corner of his mouth. Stop talking nonsense and be obedient and hand over your life. At this moment, after hearing what Lin Yu said, the Lord of Samsara's expression suddenly froze, and a gloomy look flashed across the corners of his eyes and brows. After waiting for a moment, the Lord of Samsara punched Lin Yu's chest. Lin Yu also kicked the Lord of Samsara on the chest. The two of them moved back one after another and retreated. After a few steps, he managed to regain his balance. At this time, Lin Yu was staring at the Lord of Reincarnation with a smile on his face, and a somewhat cold look flashed in his eyes. At this moment, the Lord of Samsara seemed to be aware of the terror and horror of Lin Yu. He stared at Lin Yu warily, and then sighed heavily. It seems that you have made up your mind to kill me, right? Obviously, the Lord of Samsara at this moment has completely lost the power to resist Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu nodded lightly. Yes, if you have any last words, hurry up and say them. Otherwise, I'm afraid you won't even have a chance to say your last words. A slight sneer appeared at the corner of Lin Yu's mouth, and at this moment, the Lord of Samsara's eyes were filled with a gloomy look, and the murderous intent on his body was fully visible. Boy, you may not be able to defeat me yet. At this time, Lin Yu heard the Lord of Reincarnation. After he finished speaking, he half closed his eyes, turned his head, and glanced coldly at the Lord of Reincarnation. Really? Then give it a try. Bar. The two of them fought together again. Lin Yu later remembered that he had left the previous person to defeat him. The Lord of Samsara's solution seemed to be on his forehead, so at this time Lin Yu found the opportunity and stretched out his hand. 2 fingers penetrated directly through the forehead of the Lord of Samsara. After Lin Yu penetrated the Lord of Samsara's forehead, the aura on his body began to dissipate rapidly. At this time, his eyes were staring at Lin Yu, with a sense of disbelief in the corners of his eyes and brows. Look. At this moment, the Lord of Reincarnation slowly fell down, and the breath on his body began to weaken rapidly. A faint smile appeared at the corner of Lin Yu's mouth, and a hint of mockery flashed in his eyes. I've already given you the opportunity, but it seems like you're useless. At this moment, a reincarnation mark slowly floated out on the forehead of the Lord of Samsara. At this time, the Lord of Samsara looked at Lin Yu's eyes, and there was actually a bit of sympathy in his eyes. Pity. At this time there was a smile of relief on his lips. Little guy, congratulations to you, but let me remind you that this Lord of Reincarnation is not so easy to do. You have endless longevity, but you have to serve, he heard, like a lackey. That's all. I hope just take care of yourself. After the Lord of Reincarnation finished speaking, he disappeared directly between the heaven and the earth and disappeared into ashes. When Lin Yu saw the last appearance of the Lord of Reincarnation, he didn't look like he was joking with him. At this time, his expression could not help but condense slightly, and he suddenly felt a bit ominous in his heart. Premonition. At this time, Lin Yu was looking at the reincarnation mark in front of him. The pattern on the reincarnation mark looked very simple, but for some reason, Lin Yu felt that he couldn't remember the pattern no matter how he looked at it. At this moment, Lin Yu also knew that this reincarnation mark was not as simple as it seemed. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the samsara mark. At this time, he half squinted his eyes, and the corners of his mouth also evoked a somewhat meaningful smile. It seems that this mark of reincarnation is really not something that ordinary people can understand. In this case, it is best for us mortals not to participate. At this time, Lin Yu didn't say anything, and just wrapped the samsara mark with his spiritual power, and threw the samsara mark into the eye of samsara. After the spirit of reincarnation saw this place, a look of disbelief flashed through his eyes. At this moment, he couldn't help but frown slightly, and then shook his head. This guy, why is this guy so different from this ordinary person? How can ordinary people not be moved when they see the heaven-defying mark of reincarnation, but this guy is different from others? Is it possible that he is really not? It's tempting, but he can see the clues in it. At this time, Lin Yu just wanted to recall by who, but at this time, a powerful force directly wrapped his body, and then that powerful force directly pulled him into the eye of samsara. At this time, Lin Yu looked around, and then saw a figure standing in the distance, staring directly at him, as if he was looking at a monster. When Lin Yu saw the guy's eyes, he felt quite uncomfortable. At this time, he frowned slightly. Who are you? The man suddenly transformed into his previous appearance. After Lin Yu saw the spirit of reincarnation, he was not too surprised. He just smiled. Interesting, no wonder you can control reincarnation. It turns out you are the spirit of reincarnation. The reincarnation spirit had this reincarnation mark in its body. His eyes were fixed on Lin Yu's body, and a complicated look flashed in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly smiled. What do you want to say to me? Most people will take this mark as their own, but why don't you? What's going on? At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Samsara Zero said, he just smiled, and then sighed leisurely. Such heaven-defying things are beyond the comprehension of mortals like us. If you forcefully possess them, I'm afraid you will end up with the same fate as the previous Lord of Reincarnation, so I might as well return this mark of reincarnation to you. This time is not bad, isn't it? After hearing what Lin Yu said, the reincarnation spirit at this moment also nodded gently, with a meaningful smile on the corner of his mouth. What you said is really true, look at it. Things are quite clear. Survival of the beasts, awakening the beast taming system at the beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 304. At this moment, the spirit of reincarnation turned its head and stared directly at Lin Yu. A faint smile appeared at the corner of its mouth. At this moment, the spirit of reincarnation looked at Lin Yu. His scalp was numb, and he subconsciously took a few steps back, looking at the spirit of reincarnation with vigilance. I'll tell you what you want to do. If you have anything to say, just say it. Don't act like this. At this time, the spirit of reincarnation turned around and glanced at Lin Yu, with a hint of determination flashing in his eyes. I have decided that it is you. At this moment, Lin Yu was staring straight at the spirit of samsara. At this moment, he was just like the monk in Zhan confused and completely confused as to what the spirit of samsara meant by his words. What do you mean? Why don't I quite understand? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the spirit of reincarnation, and then he scratched his head. I decided to choose you as my master, how about this time? The eyes of the spirit of samsara were staring straight at Lin Yu. At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly smiled like this. His eyes were fixed on the spirit of samsara, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. Choose me as the master? Why is this happening? Because you are different from those people. The aura I feel on your body is the aura of peace and tranquility, but on those people, all I feel is a dirty and dark aura. At this moment, after Lin Yu heard what the spirit of samsara said, he raised his eyebrows slightly, and then smiled like this. Really? Then I'm really honored. But you want to recognize me as your master, but I don't want to accept you as your servant. Lin Yu just spoke unhurriedly. After the spirit of reincarnation heard what Lin Yu said, a bit of confusion clearly flashed through his eyes. At this time, his eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu. His face was full of confusion. Why? Do you know how many people want to be my master? But now that this opportunity is given to you, you don't want it? Why on earth is this? At this time, Lin Yu just smiled and shook his head. What I cultivate is to follow my heart. Anyone who goes with my heart, no matter whether it is good or bad, I will not refuse. Anyone who does not go with my heart, I will not refuse. I don't want that at all, do you understand? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the spirit of samsara. At this time, the spirit of samsara could not help but shake his head. I really don't understand what you're saying, but since you've already said it here, I don't have much to say. Anyway, it's all up to you. After the spirit of reincarnation finished speaking, it disappeared directly in front of Lin Yu. At this time, a slight sneer appeared on the corner of Lin Yu's mouth. If you want to leave, just walk faster. It's always like this. What are you doing in hiding? Lin Yu just spoke unhurriedly. At this moment, after listening to what Lin Yu said, the face of the reincarnation spirit suddenly sank, and then the next second, Lin Yu felt that he was completely restrained behind him. At this time, the spirit of reincarnation suddenly stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Lin Yu's body, and a murderous intention spread quietly. Boy, this matter is not up to you. This time, you can't agree if you want to, or if you don't want to, you can't agree. This time it depends on my mood. At this time, the spirit of reincarnation spoke to Lin Yu in a cold voice. Lin Yu heard the spirit of reincarnation, but after finishing speaking, he also cursed secretly. Asshole, it's so disgusting. Everyone else is vying for it, but I don't want it. Why do you force it on me? I've never seen a guy like you. After the spirit of reincarnation heard what Lin Yu said, he was furious at the time. At this moment, he glared fiercely at Lin Yu, with a gloomy look flashing in his eyes. Boy, stop talking nonsense, it's really going to happen if you don't agree to this today. At this time, 3 black lines appeared on Lin Yu's forehead, and he was speechless for a while. At this moment, he just sighed heavily, and he didn't know what to say at that time. And just after this moment, an extremely tyrannical force came straight towards Lin Yu's face. At this moment, Lin Yu only felt that his vision went dark, and then he fainted. In the past, at that moment, Lin Yu felt like he was sinking endlessly. After waiting for this moment, Lin Yu woke up leisurely. At this time, his eyes evoked some complicated colors, and then he couldn't help but raised his eyebrows slightly. At this moment, something flashed in his eyes. The complex meaning of points. It's weird, it's just so weird. Why is it like this? I can't explain it, I can't explain it. It turned out that Lin Yu was actually on a stone platform like this at this time, so at this time he had no idea what happened and why it was like this. After waiting for this moment, Lin Yu seemed to understand something, and a few meaningful smiles appeared at the corners of his mouth. That's it, I say. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he suddenly rushed up. His speed was so fast that he stood above the samsara platform in just a moment. At this moment, Lin Yu looked down at everything from a high place, just like a god who ruled the world. At this moment, Lin Yu was heard calling softly, Bao Si, where is it? Bao Si, where is it? Bao Si, where is it? Lin Yu called out 3 times in a row, and then a beautiful soul suddenly appeared in front of Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Bao Si. At this moment, even Lin Yu had to admit that King Yu of Zhou had a good eye. Bao Si knelt down in front of Lin Yu, I pay my respects to the Lord of Reincarnation. At this moment, Lin Yu just waved his hand gently, stand up. Bao Si stood up slowly, with a flash of fear in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. Looking at Bao Si's spirit like this, Lin Yu knew that Bao Si must have been bullied a lot in these days. At this moment, he also felt quite sympathetic towards Bao Si. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 305. I wonder what your lord has to say to your servant. Lin Yu just waved his hand gently and smiled, it's not a big deal. It's just that an old friend wants to see you. Is it convenient for you? After Bao Si heard what Lin Yu said, she couldn't help but half squinted her eyes and turned around, staring straight at Lin Yu, with a bit of confusion flashing in her eyes. I wonder who the old friend the adults are talking about is. After Lin Yu heard Bao Si say this, a meaningful smile suddenly appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a hint of amusement flashed in his eyes, then you should take a guess. At this time, Bao Si shook his head, with a desolate look in his eyes, which made people look quite distressed. Master Qi, this servant doesn't know. After Lin Yu heard what Bao Si said, he just smiled and shook his head, in that case, okay, King Zhou Yu, do you still remember? At this time, Bao Si heard Lin Yu. After saying this, her eyes suddenly became moist. Her eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, with a feeling of complete disbelief in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. Look. Sir, are you telling the truth? Did he really come to me? At this time, Bao Si's voice was trembling slightly. When Lin Yu heard Bao Si say this, he felt a little distressed for no reason in his heart. Then he turned around, glanced at Bao Si and nodded gently. He nodded, and then let out a long sigh. Yes, He asked me to come to you, but this matter cannot be based on his own wishes. I am here to ask you now. If you agree, then go back with me. If you don't agree, of course you can still stay here. The concubine was naturally very excited in her heart. Master Chi, I am willing, I am willing. Bao Si's voice was trembling a little. After Lin Yu heard Bao Si say this, he also nodded slightly. Okay, if you are willing, then enter into my palm and hold your heart. Concentrate on me, I will take you back now. At this time, Lin Yu was like the king of gods in the heavens, quite majestic before the common people. At this time, the praise entered Lin Yu's palm, and Lin Yu suddenly noticed something strange. At this time, his eyes narrowed to a slit, and something flashed across his eyes. Special colors. After a moment, Lin Yu suddenly laughed like this. What's the point of teasing me like this? If you don't want to recognize me as your master, then there is no need to act like this. Besides, I have no intention of becoming your master in the first place. But what you are doing now is a bit too much. The spirit of reincarnation seemed to hear Lin Yu's voice, and then the door of reincarnation began to tremble violently. Ha ha ha, okay, since you agreed to be my master, then of course I have to obey your orders. This gate of reincarnation will be put into your sea of consciousness first. At this time, after the spirit of reincarnation finished speaking, the gate of reincarnation began to tremble violently, and then the gate of reincarnation rose from the ground. In an instant, the gate of reincarnation burst through, entering Lin Yu's sea of consciousness. At this time, Lin Yu felt as if his sea of consciousness was about to explode. He let out a low roar, and a look of pain flashed across his face. At this time, he covered his head in pain. Holding his head, his expression began to look slightly ferocious as he went back and forth like this. At this moment, Lin Yu clenched his fists and gritted his teeth. After waiting for this moment, he couldn't bear it anymore, and let out a painful roar from his mouth. I don't know, but after a long time, Lin Yu slowly began to get better. At this time, Lin Yu felt that his body was extremely weak. A bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and his face was filled with a look of pain. But at this moment, Lin Yu heard an elegant female voice coming from his mind. Congratulations to the host, the mission is completed, and the reward points are 10 billion. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what the system said, his eyes were full of excitement. At this time, he began to browse the mall. However, the strange beasts in the mall needed to the points are all above 10 billion. When Lin Yu saw this scene, a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, a look of helplessness flashed in his eyes, and then he shook his head. Oh, the points in my hand still seem to be far behind. What should I do? At this time, Lin Yu's eyes and brows were filled with a look of complete helplessness, and the bitter smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this moment, a mysterious force suddenly flowed down from the void, and then the force immediately enveloped Lin Yu. Then Lin Yu turned around and glanced at Arya beside him, with a bit of confusion flashing in his eyes. Arya, what on earth is going on? At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Arya's eyes flashed with confusion, and then shook his head. Report to the master, I don't understand what's going on, but it shouldn't be bad for you. At this time, after hearing what Arya said, 3 black lines appeared on Lin Yu's forehead, and he was speechless. But what's going on? Shouldn't you explain it to me? Lin Yu's eyes stared at Arya, and at this time, Arya's mouth corners also raised a few bitter smiles, and a few helpless meanings flashed in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. Report to the master, I can't explain this kind of thing too clearly, but the master may understand what's going on after a while. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly felt that his soul trembled so suddenly, and finally he heard a voice that seemed to come from this ancient wilderness, ringing in his ears. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Sheng Chong. Chapter 306. Congratulations to the host for unlocking Xiantian Prison. Xiantian Prison can be used for free once a day. It has the opportunity to summon ancient beasts of different grades and strengths. It can be activated within one day. The first time is free, and the second time is required. It consumes 100,000 points, the third activation consumes 1 million points, and the fourth activation consumes 10 million points. After Lin Yu heard this voice, excitement flashed across his eyes and brows. At this time, the smile on his lips began to become more and more obvious. I didn't expect it. I really didn't expect it. This time I unexpectedly unlocked the Xiantian Prison. It seems that the function of the Xiantian Prison is very unbelievable. At this moment, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Arya's eyes flashed with some complex colors, and then she nodded gently and smiled, then congratulations to the host this time. Lin Yu just waved his hand casually, not bad, I'm lucky this time. But at this moment, Lin Yu suddenly remembered that he seemed to have to send this praise back quickly. After all, he had been out for a long time this time. At this time, in the ancient tomb, the third prince and King Zhou looked at each other. There was a special color in their eyes, and then they couldn't help but frown slightly. How come this little guy hasn't come back for so long? If his soul leaves his body for too long, he may not be able to re-enter his body in the end. King Zhou said coldly, with a hint of worry clearly flashing through the corners of his eyes and brows. In fact, for him, it wasn't that important what Lin Yu was doing. The most important thing was probably Bao Si's praise. Safety, and whether Lin Yu can bring Bao Si back as he said. When King Zhou thought of this, there was something special in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. He turned his head and glanced at King Guzhu. Tell me, did this little guy lie to me? King Zhou said in a cold voice, a cold look flashed across his eyes and brows. At this time, after King Guzhu heard what King Zhou said, a bit of complexity flashed in his eyes, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. It's hard to say, don't just say it, and don't just listen to it and believe it. After King Zhou said this, King Guzhu's expression became obviously unnatural. He knew clearly that his brother seemed to be somewhat alienated from him, so at this time he took a step forward and glanced towards King Zhou. Brother, I know you are still brooding about what happened back then, but in the conscience of heaven and earth, I never did anything that was sorry for you in the slightest. I dare to swear to heaven and earth. A certain look of determination flashed through King Guzhu's eyes, and his eyes were fixed directly on King Zhou, with quite a bit of determination in his eyes. At this time, after King Zhou heard what King Guzhu said, he couldn't help but turn his head and glance towards him. The corners of his mouth raised slightly, with a slightly evil arc. I didn't seem to say much just now, did you misunderstand something? After King Guzhu heard what King Zhou said, he frowned slightly, and a special color flashed in his eyes. Then he sighed heavily, but he did not say anything randomly. What's up? At this moment, Lin Yu opened his eyes leisurely, and then glanced forward, a strange color flashed in his eyes, and then he shook his head and smiled, I've been spending too much time here, and now it's time to go back. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he suddenly had this thought in his mind, and then he took a step forward, and then he disappeared in front of everyone. Just after this moment, Lin Yu seemed to be aware of something. His expression froze slightly, and then he raised his eyebrows, and then he rushed straight ahead. Go. There seemed to be something hiding in this space. He stretched out his hand and grabbed the thing out immediately. At this time, Lin Yu stared directly at the guy he caught in his hand. A somewhat gloomy look flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intention on his body also emerged. Hurry up and tell me who sent you here. At this time, the man was strangled by Lin Yu's throat. At this time, he slapped Lin Yu's arm desperately, with a look of pain on his face, and his expression even became a little ferocious. However, it was naturally impossible for Lin Yu to let him go so easily at this moment. A mocking smile appeared on the corner of Lin Yu's lips, and a gloomy look flashed in his eyes. Interesting, you are really interesting. You are no match for me, not to mention that I am the absolute master in this space, so just accept your fate. At this moment, the man heard Lin Yu, and after saying this, his hand movements were really much lighter. At this time, Lin Yu turned his head and stared at the guy, with a gloomy look in his eyes. Now can you tell me who sent you here? Lin Yu's tone was quite gloomy and cold. After seeing Lin Yu like this, the guy also showed a bit of fear. But a moment later, the guy suddenly laughed out loud, as if he was completely crazy. Lin Yu's eyes narrowed into a slit, and the murderous intent on his body suddenly rose, and the murderous intent suddenly appeared. You actually don't take me seriously. If that's the case, then you'd better die obediently. Lin Yu said this with gritted teeth, and then his palm suddenly exerted force. At this time, the man was directly wiped out. A dark shadow in the dark stared at Lin Yu, with a mocking smile on his face, and then he shook his head. That's all, nothing to be afraid of. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 307. After seeing this scene, Baihu's eyes flashed with confusion. He turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu, and then frowned slightly. I still don't understand. Why do you have to kill that guy? Keeping him might be useful, and maybe you can find out something. It's better than killing him directly. After Lin Yu heard Baihu say this, he chuckled a little, and then shook his head. I don't know if you just discovered it or not. After Baihu heard what Lin Yu said, his brows knitted together. He turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu. What did you find? Stop pretending to be weird with me here. If you find something, please tell me immediately. After Lin Yu heard Baihu's joking, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. However, he didn't say much at this time, he just shook his head with a smile. It's just a person's aura. That person's aura is very powerful, and it's hiding in the dark. He must have discovered that person's aura, so he refused to say anything. At this moment, after Baihu heard what Lin Yu said, a bit of disbelief flashed in his pupils, and then he frowned slightly. Is what you said true? There is really something wrong with that guy. Baihu's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu. There was a look of complete disbelief in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, Lin Yu just smiled like this. That's natural. Anyway, that guy is in the dark. First of all, this person doesn't dare to say anything. Secondly, even if he wants to say it, I'm afraid he will be beaten before he can say it. Kill that guy. In this case, I might as well just kill this guy. After Baihu heard what Lin Yu said, he was speechless for a while. If you said that, I would be really speechless. Lin Yu just smiled. Maybe. At this time, Lin Yu was like this, looking forward with burning eyes. There was a special color in his eyes, and then he sighed leisurely. Oh, it's getting late, it seems it's time for me to go back. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he took the white tiger back, and then with a thought, the space-time beast appeared in front of him. At this moment, the space-time beast glanced at Lin Yu, with a somewhat complicated look in his eyes. At this time, after Lin Yu saw the time and space beast like this, a special color flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. Do you have anything to say? The space-time beast was completely hesitant to speak. There is indeed something I need to remind you of. Lin Yu raised his eyebrows slightly. Tell me what's going on. Even if I can go back this time, I'm afraid the landing point and nodes may be different, and the power of time and space here is extremely chaotic. I don't understand what is going on, so this. The time and space beast paused immediately after saying this. Lin Yu heard the time and space beast. After saying this, his face sank slightly, and there was a special color in his eyes. I know it, but it doesn't matter much. Life and death are destiny, wealth is in the sky, everything depends on fate, I believe you can do it. Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at the space-time beast. At this time, the space-time beast was quite embarrassed. I need some of the power of time and space in this place. Maybe it can help me figure out accurately the laws of the power of time and space in this place now. If not, I want to find out what the laws of the power of time and space are. In that case I'm afraid it's a bit difficult. After Lin Yu heard what the time and space beast said, he couldn't help but half squinted his eyes. There was a strange color in his eyes, and then he smiled slightly. This is simple, this time and space is all over the mountains and plains, you can take as much power as you want. The time and space beast shook his head. This power of reincarnation contains the power of time and space. In other words, the power of time and space here has been completely disturbed by the power of reincarnation, so now I want to figure out how is the power of this side of time and space. I'm afraid it's a bit difficult. Lin Yu heard about the time and space beast. After he finished speaking, his eyes narrowed to a slit, and there was a special color in his eyes. That's it. But there's no need to worry, the mountain people have their own problems. Great idea. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the space-time beast's eyes clearly flashed with confusion. I don't know, Master, what can you do? At this time, Lin Yu jumped into the air, and then flew to the 9 heavens. The power of time and space above the 9 heavens here appears to be unusually calm, with no signs of restlessness at all. After seeing this scene, the time and space beast looked overjoyed. He was so excited that he was a little incoherent. Yes, it is here, it is here. The power of time and space here is very calm. If we use the power of time and space here, it's not that difficult to calculate the landing point. After Lin Yu heard what the space-time beast said, he nodded slightly, and there was something special in his eyes. If this is the case, then why not quickly extract the power of time and space? The space-time beast just jumped forward so suddenly. The action looked quite funny, and then the space-time beast seemed to be grabbing randomly. After a moment, the space beast suddenly returned to Lin Yu's side, and then immediately turned its head, glanced at Lin Yu, and nodded gently, with a flash in his eyes. A bit of excitement. Nailed it? At this moment, after Lin Yu heard what the space-time beast said, he turned his head and glanced at the space-time beast, with a bit of excitement flashing in his eyes. Is it done now? If that's the case, let's cast the spell quickly. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the space-time beast. At this time, the space-time beast also nodded so seriously, and then began to chant the incantation, and then in the void, an extremely huge array appeared. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 308. The space-time beast just pounced toward the Genpan, and then the huge array began to rotate slowly. The space-time beast turned its head, glanced at Lin Yu, and then he gestured towards Lin Yu like this frantically. After waiting for this moment, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly realize something. He turned his head in the direction behind him and waved a sword energy, which flew out from his cuffs. After the man in the dark saw the sword energy, his face darkened slightly, and then he subconsciously stood up and dodged. The man's movements were not slow, and he dodged like this. When the man saw this scene, a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a hint of amusement flashed in his eyes. It's interesting, it's really interesting. I didn't expect that he could actually find me. This little guy is really quite capable. After the man finished speaking, he turned around and left. After a moment, Lin Yu entered the time and space directly. After a burst of lightning and flint, Lin Yu's entire soul suddenly appeared in the ancient tomb, and then he rushed directly towards his body. King Zhou Yu and King Guz, who were originally worried that all their efforts would be in vain, but at this moment, Lin Yu suddenly opened his eyes. After King Zhou Yu and King Guz, who saw this scene, their eyes were full of excitement. At this moment, King Zhou Yu suddenly stood up and stared at Lin Yu. The corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a look of anticipation. How is it? How is the situation? How is the situation? Did you bring back the remnants of Bao Si? King Zhou Yu's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and his words were almost incoherent. At this time, Lin Yu took out a small white jade porcelain bottle from his arms and dropped it directly into King Zhou Yu's hand. Fortunately, I did not disgrace my life. This matter was done reluctantly. It is done. King Zhou Yu quickly grabbed the small white jade porcelain vase. At this time, King Zhou Yu seemed to be holding the most precious treasure in the world, caressing it carefully. What to do now? At this time, Lin Yu glanced at King Zhou Yu. You have been studying for so many years. I must be speechless in front of you. It's up to you what to do. King Zhou Yu summoned all the remaining souls of Bao Si, and then carefully removed the cork from the bottle. At this time, every movement of King Zhou Yu was very gentle, as if he was caressing his lover's face, and he could not bear to cause pain or injury. At this time, Bao Si's remains were released by King Zhou Yu. Then King Zhou Yu thought, and a crystal coffin appeared in front of everyone. The corpse in the coffin was Bao Si. Undoubtedly. At this time, King Zhou Yu bit the tip of his tongue, and using his own essence and blood as a guide, he slowly began to outline the magic circle in the void. At this time, King Zhou Yu's face began to change. He became increasingly pale. When King Guz, who on the side, saw this scene, a special color flashed in his eyes, and Lin Yu on the side couldn't help but feel moved after seeing this scene. At this time, a gloomy look flashed across King Zhou Yu's eyes. At this time, he half squinted his eyes, and then his body began to emit a special radiance. Then the power of the heaven and earth became faintly turbulent, and then the power of the world around it gave people a mysterious feeling. Immediately afterwards, the surrounding world began to become turbulent, and the power made people feel a bit fearful. That mysterious power surged toward one side rapidly and violently, and then at the end, the hanging power on that side actually exploded completely. The crystal coffin was blown to pieces in an instant. In just a moment, the crystal coffin was blown into pieces. The power made people feel a bit frightened. Just after this moment, Lin Yu seemed to understand something. He suddenly opened his eyes, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. So that's it, Xian. The energy of the sky is never the same. From the beginning of the heaven and the earth, everything is impermanent. Yin and yang are in harmony, and everything is in succession. There is no one thing in the world, but the yin and yang gather and disperse. At this time, Lin Yu was muttering in a low voice, and after finishing, he pointed forward suddenly, and then followed by the vast rushing power, it seemed as if it was about to explode. But after a moment, Lin Yu discovered the clues. He only felt a violent force rushing directly to his chest, and then his whole body flew out directly like this. At the end, he fell to the ground, and a mouthful of blood spurted out from his mouth. At this time, Lin Yu's face suddenly became ugly. His brows seemed to be knitted together, and there was a sense of complete panic in the corners of his eyes and brows. What exactly does this guy want to do? If he uses this kind of heaven-defying method, I'm afraid we will only be dead by then. What should we do? Lin Yu said coldly. At this time, after the King of Guz, who heard what Lin Yu said, he turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu. A bit of confusion flashed in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but look like this. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? Why can't I understand you? King Guzhu's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, with quite a bit of confusion in his eyes. At this moment, Lin Yu also had a wry smile on his lips, and a hint of helplessness flashed in his eyes. You don't understand. It's just that you don't understand. He uses the method of unraveling yin and yang. Of course, ordinary people will not notice the clues. But ordinary people can't notice it, but I can notice it. He has no good intentions. Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at that guy. At this moment, he really wanted to stop this guy. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 309. Lin Yu suddenly took a step forward. His eyes were fixed on that guy, and a fierce killing intent quietly spread from Lin Yu's body. When he came out, at this time, his eyes were wide open with anger, and his body was filled with murderous intent. At this moment, King Zhou did indeed feel the murderous intention in Lin Yu's body at this moment, but at this moment, he didn't care at all about the corner of his mouth, just a sneer, and his eyes were full of mockery. Color. Little guy, of course I can feel your anger now, but what if you are angry now? You can't do anything to me. Have you seen this entire ancient tomb? This entire ancient tomb is a formation. You are already in this game and want to break free. How is that possible? King Zhou also laughed like this after he finished speaking. At this time, his face was full of a look of madness. At this moment, King Zhou was completely like a madman, completely losing all his reason. Lin Yu just clenched his fists and gritted his teeth, and the murderous intent in his body was unreservedly displayed. At this time, he stared at King Zhou with a smile on his face, the look in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. A bit of murderous intent was released without missing a beat. Interesting, it's really interesting. If I don't kill you today, it will be difficult to eliminate the hatred in my heart. After King Zhou heard what Lin Yu said, he half squinted his eyes and looked at Lin Yu straightly. Little guy, if you say you want to kill me, that would be too arrogant. You're so arrogant, why do you think you have the power to fight me? King Zhou let out an angry roar, and the murderous look in his eyes seemed to break through the sky. After all, he has waited too long for today, and he doesn't want to wait any longer, so for King Zhou, it can be said that people are blocking people and killing gods, and gods are blocking gods. Anyone who stops me will die. After King Guzhu saw the scene at this time, a hint of panic clearly flashed through his eyes. His eyes were staring straight at King Zhou, and the corners of his mouth curled up. A bit of a wry smile. Brother, you have to think twice and calm down. King Zhou turned his head and glanced coldly at King Guzhu. A bit of coldness flashed in his eyes, and the gloomy killing intent on his body was unreservedly displayed. A sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. I want to calm down? Ha ha ha, then tell me, how should I calm down? Tell me. King Zhou said in a cold voice in a leisurely manner, with a gloomy look in his eyes and between his brows. At this time, the king of Guzhu felt like he was falling into an ice cave after seeing this scene. The corner of his mouth raised a bit of a bitter smile, and the corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a sense of helplessness. Brother, you have done enough for this woman, are you going to kill me for this woman? King Guzhu planned to play some family cards, maybe he could move King Zhou, but at this time King Zhou just turned his head with a casual wave, and glanced at King Guzhu coldly. Something flashed in his eyes. A very gloomy look. What will happen if I kill you? Who do you think you are? It's just a dream for you to even think of being as beautiful as me. After seeing this scene, the king of Guzhu had a wry smile on his lips. He knew that his eldest brother was probably crazy now, and it was impossible to dissuade him, so he just did this. Just gave up. What should we do now? I think you should have seen my elder brother's madness. If he is allowed to continue like this, then I'm afraid. The king of Guzhu paused when he said this. There was also a bit of a wry smile on the corner of his mouth, and a bit of helplessness flashed in the corners of his eyes and brows. After Lin Yu heard what King Guzhu said, he half closed his eyes. He turned his head and glanced coldly at King Guzhu, and then frowned slightly. Leave this matter to me. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he suddenly moved towards the front. His speed was extremely fast, and he suddenly came to the front of King Guzhu. Without saying a word, he moved towards King Guzhu's chest. In this way, a magic circle was directly drawn. The king of Guzhu felt that his body was filled with a burning sensation. At this moment, he was staring directly at Lin Yu, with complete myopia in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and a kind of confusion. The two of us should be allies now. Why do you want to help him deal with me? Why do you do this? This Guzhu king was already a bit hysterical. After Lin Yu heard what Guzhu king said, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. Stop talking nonsense, you should feel this power for yourself first. After hearing what Lin Yu said, King Guzhu's eyes flashed with a special light. At this time, he felt a burning sensation filling his body. The burning feeling was so wonderful that it was hard to explain or understand. Why is my body filled with this burning feeling? What's going on? At this time, the king of Guzhu turned his head and stared at Lin Yu, with a look of confusion in his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, Lin Yu raised a meaningful smile at the corner of his mouth. He turned his head and looked at the king of Guzhu. His face was slightly condensed, and several different lights flashed in his eyes and eyebrows. After a moment, Lin Yu suddenly stepped forward. The King Zhou's mind moved, and then a green lion suddenly appeared in front of everyone. This green lion was extremely majestic. When he appeared in this space was faintly trembling. At this time, Lin Yu saw this green lion and understood why the king of Guzhu had such a domineering intention. At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with some special colors, and then he couldn't help but shook his head and smiled, with a complex expression flashing in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Interesting, it's really interesting. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Sheng Chong. Chapter 310. At this moment, after seeing this scene, King Zhou turned his head and his eyes were fixed on King Guzhu. At this time, a cold light flashed in King Zhou's eyes, and the murderous intention on his body was even more intense. Stern. I didn't expect it. What I never expected was that one day you would actually take action against me. Is it possible that you don't want me to reunite with your sister-in-law? King Zhou's eyes were fixed on the king of Guzhu, a gloomy look flashed in his eyes, and the murderous aura on his body was revealed without any reservation. At this time, after King Guzhu heard what King Zhou said, he also had a bit of a bitter smile on his lips, and there was a look of helplessness in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Brother, your obsession has become so deep now that you may not be able to listen to what I say now. You can't go on like this. King Zhou's eyes were staring straight at King Guzhu, and the corner of his mouth also evoked a slight smile. Ha ha ha, okay, originally I wanted to drain you of your essence and blood and leave you one life, but it seems like it won't be necessary now. If that's the case, then you'd better die. King Zhou's expression suddenly became ferocious. At this moment, he suddenly stepped forward and was in front of King Guzhou. At this time, the green lion let out an angry roar, and then rushed towards King Zhou. This weak Yao face suddenly became ugly, and he also let out a low roar. The green lion seemed to feel the fear of Zhou Yao, and he subconsciously moved towards the back, just like that. He took several steps back. At this moment, King Zhou just looked at King Shi coldly, with a gloomy murderous intention in the corners of his eyes and brows. That murderous aura as cold as silk gave people an indescribable feeling. After waiting for this moment, Zhou Yuewang suddenly smiled like this, with a hint of mockery in his eyes. After so many years, this green lion has only been promoted to this epic realm. It seems to be nothing more than that, but he actually claims to have ancient bloodline, which is simply ridiculous. Lin Yu glanced at the green lion. After he glanced at the green lion, his expression also condensed slightly. Exotic beast, blue lion epic level 9, level 49. Qualification, alien, intermediate. Life, 9999999999777. Speed, 9999999999777. Defense, 9999999999777. Attack, 9999999999777. Skills, Innate Chaos, Understanding Heaven and Earth. Innate Chaos, Green Lion activates its skills to swallow the energy of heaven and earth, the sun and the moon. It can quickly swallow the spiritual power between heaven and earth, and the other world quickly forms a vacuum state. It is mysterious and boundless, and the Tao is the law of all things. Understand the heaven and earth. King Shi activates his skills to use the power of time and space in a space to understand the mystery of this space. He can borrow the power of heaven and earth and turn it into his own use, which is extremely mysterious and powerful. Although the skill of this green lion is simple and the level is not high, when Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but gasped. Even he had to admit that the skill of this green lion was indeed very perverted. At this time, after King Zhou Yu saw this scene, a cold light flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intention in his body was quietly released, and his eyes were fixed on King Guzhu. Okay, very good, very good. Since you are unkind, don't blame me for being unjust. Don't forget that the twin blue lions and peacocks are kings. The 9 heavens magic feather will always be more powerful than the barking and dancing blue lion in your hand. Much more, since you want to die, then I will help you. King Zhou Yu said in a cold voice. At this time, after King Zhou Yu heard what King Zhou Yu said, his face instantly turned ugly. At this time, his eyes were staring straight at looking at King Zhou Yu. The corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a sense of complete fear. At this moment, I heard King Zhou Yu say softly from his mouth, the 9 heavens magic feather appears. Alien beast, 9 heavens fantasy feather epic level 9, level 49. Qualification, alien, intermediate. Life, 9999999999777. Speed, 9999999999777. Defense, 9999999999777. Attack, 9999999999777. Skills, thousands of rains are falling, thousands of swords are ringing. 10,000 rains, Jushin Huanyu activates his skills and pours out the feathers on his wings. At the same time the sound is as vast as the sea of smoke, and the rivers and lakes are misty, like 10,000 laws. Thousands of swords ring in unison. Jushin Huanyu activates his skills to summon all the sword spirits in the world, whether they are enemies or friends, they can all be dispatched for him. It is extremely powerful. At this moment, Lin Yu saw a huge peacock suddenly appear in front of him. A look of disbelief flashed in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but wrinkle slightly. Frown. Lin Yu just half squinted his eyes, a special color flashed in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but shook his head and smiled. It's interesting, but it's really interesting. The 9-day magic feather embodies all things, the beginning of the end of the world, the beginning of all things, the ancestor of birds, and the death of beasts. At this moment, King Zhou Yu on the side couldn't help laughing after hearing what Lin Yu said. He turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu. Little guy, you do have some knowledge. Yes, this Jushin magic feather is the ancestor of flying birds, and is much more powerful than the blue lion. Today, you little guy has some knowledge. After Lin Yu heard what the green lion said, the corners of his mouth couldn't help but evoke a few meaningful smiles. He turned his head and glanced at the green lion, and a few words flashed between his eyebrows. A very playful look. It looks like you may have met your opponent this time. After Qing Shi heard what Lin Yu said, he let out a low roar, seeming to express his dissatisfaction with Lin Yu. At this time, after Lin Yu heard the low roar from Qing Shi's mouth, a special color clearly flashed through his eyes. After a while, he suddenly stepped forward with his eyes dead. Staring at Qing Shi, murderous intent suddenly appeared on his body.